In reaction to the speech, I'm pleased to introduce to my right my colleague Orde Kittrie, who's a senior fellow at FDD. He's a leading expert on nonproliferation and Iran sanctions policy, and he previously served for 11 years at the Department of State as the department's lead to nuclear affairs attorney. To his right is Valerie Lincy, who's the executive director of the Wisconsin Project on Nuclear Arms Control. She oversees the project's risk report database and Iran Watch website. And Andrew Tabler is the Martin J. Gross Fellow at the Washington Institute, focuses his research on Syria and U.S. policy in the Levant, has had really unparalleled access to Bashar Al Assad's Syria. He spent 14 years of residence in the Middle East and served as co-founder and editor-in-chief of Syria Today. So really great experts on Iran, on Syria, on nonproliferation, on compliance issues. And I'm just going to turn it to each of you. Just give me your reaction to Assistant Secretary Pablette's comments. Anything that struck you or stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a very important reiteration of some of the key points that we've been seeing coming out of the administration. One thing that struck me, perhaps particularly as an international lawyer, was the statement where she said, Iran has not yet demonstrated to the world that it's rectified its egregious record of noncompliance with Articles 2 and 3 of the NPT. And my own view is that the Iranian nuclear archive that was taken out of Iran by the Israelis is raising a lot of questions, indeed, about whether Iran is currently in noncompliance, currently in violation of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, as well as Iran's Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is required by the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. And I wonder if Ilem's statement there was perhaps a reference to those continuing questions, which have in fact been accelerated, I would say exacerbated, by the material that has come out as part of the archives.
Okay. Valerie?
Well, I was struck, and Andrew and I were speaking about this before coming on here, by happily struck by the focus on Syria, and Syria's use of chemical weapons, which, as someone who represents a nonproliferation organization, I've been frustrated by the sort of lack of continued, sustained emphasis on the need to do something about that, both within the OPCW and then and the UN and outside of those organizations, if not enough can be done. And then, as Orde said, a strong reiteration of the shortcomings of the JCPOA and a path forward on how to look for improvements.
Okay.
First, thanks very much for having me today, and thanks to all of you for coming out. Yeah, it's interesting, speaking about, I expected this discussion to be Iran first, then Syria, because that's most of the time when we look at this problem, or when those in the region look at the threat posed by Iran, they see it as paramount. Interesting that it starts with Syria, then goes to Iran. So I think this really shows that Syria remains a major problem in this regard, beyond the civil war, beyond the politics. Syria, before the war, and we had problems with their chemical weapons stockpile. I think it was one of the largest stockpiles in the world, or if not the largest. There had the nuclear issue with the Deir ez-Zor El Kibar reactor, and I was in Syria that day. And let me tell you, I mean, it was a really eye-opening experience for all of us that covered Syria to think that, the first time that North Korea would be found proliferating outside of its borders would be out in Deir ez-Zor, of all places. There's that. And then, of course, we had Bashar's erratic and malevolent nature, right? And how much different Bashar's behavior was vis-a-vis Hafez al-Assad, who was brutal but more predictable. Bashar's behavior was sort of all over the place. Since the war and after the war, so to speak, it's clear that Syria is becoming an even bigger problem. On chemical weapons use, or on chemical weapons we have use, at least 4 cases which are verified by the regime, 2 by ISIS. But then you have Syria joining the CWC as part of the Red Line Agreement, or the subsequent Red Line Agreement. Then you have continued use and violating of the CWC through the use of chlorine and sarin, in at least a couple of cases. and also multiple problems with obviously their declarations, because if sarin's used after that it was supposed to be disposed of, it begs the question, well, where did it come from in the first place? And it would be a good question, I don't know, to Orde and to others, what other violators of the CWC have we had to that degree in its, 21-year or 20-year, roughly 20-year history? So then we have the nuclear problem outstanding, and I think it was important to emphasize that. But I thought it was very interesting as she got to the end of her Syria comments, and this has led to our conversation a little bit, that she was referring, I think, a bit to how much the context has changed, because Bashar al Assad did not win the Syrian civil war on his own steam. He won it through a military intervention by a number of neighboring countries, and on his side has been Iran and the Russian Federation. So in a way, I think it implied that some of the subsequent problems that she talked about, the threats coming from Iran, that Syria could potentially be a launch pad for those problems, in part of the general concern of Iran projecting its power to the Mediterranean and beyond.
Well, Andrew, let me ask you this, because I sort of was struck during the speech, and I'm often struck during these discussions on non-proliferation issues. They're very technical, they're very legalistic, there's a lot of acronyms. But of course, behind all of this is our humanitarian issues that, in Syria are stunning. So, I mean, is it fair to say that our Syria policy, broadly speaking, has been an abysmal bipartisan failure? And despite all the speeches given and all the sanctions issued and the limited military strikes, Bashar al Assad has won the Syrian civil war. He did so using the most horrendous tactics, both chemical weapons and using conventional weapons. There's, 500,000 people dead, there are millions of refugees, and he emerged out of this not only victorious, but in winning this victory, what non-proliferation norms? what norms are left?
Sure. I mean, it's a very good point. First of all, in my opinion, and this is not a secret, I'm kind of well known on this subject. Primary responsibility for Syria policy, as we see it now, is that of the Obama administration, because they handled so much of the Syrian civil war and the various choices along the way. And since that time, in order to affect the outcome of the civil war, would require wanting to become more militarily involved inside of the country, especially given the depleted nature of the Assad regime's forces, the various spheres of influence inside of the country. The United States decided that it didn't want to do that for a variety of reasons. So we're then left with the current situation in which we have a humanitarian disaster, over half of the Syrian people outside of their homes, over 80-some instances of the use of chemical weapons as pertains to this discussion. Haley, I believe, spoke about 50 instances, but here we've talked about 4. Yeah. But anyways, it's important to note that I think, a couple of things. One is Western countries have noticed that the problem is not so much about where Bashar used this and that and where the Assad regime used it, but rather that it's part of a set pattern of behavior that has ground down the Syrian people into submission under an Iranian and Russian sphere of influence, so to speak. And I think that becomes a big
right.
Big
well,
problem.
Valerie, let's just continue along those lines. So we've had dozens of sanctions against the Assad regime. We've had international condemnation, certainly not at the UN Security Council because of Russia, but sort of public condemnation. We've had lots of speeches. We've had limited military strikes by the United States and our key allies. None of this has worked. None of it has been effective. I would posit to you. And are we going to bring Assad and his henchmen to justice? Does this an indication that sanctions are a useless tool in actually deterring and punishing WMD violations, and even limited military strikes of the very limited nature that were leveled by President Trump seem to have had no effect? What do you say to that?
Well, I'm surprised to say that I feel like there are some positive elements to be drawn out of the Syria, what has happened in Syria, both from a non-proliferation point of view and from a more broadly. At first, I would say that it had the process through the OPCW and the United Nations has been slow, but there has been some success. I mean, Syria submitted a declaration of its chemical weapons stockpile. That declared stockpile was destroyed. The facilities that Syria declared were visited by UN inspectors, by OPCW inspectors. So there was a process that was successful. Now, clearly, we can see from the continued use of chemical weapons that the declaration was not complete. But there have been technical teams going out to verify the declaration. And here you see a bit of a parallel with Iran, the value of a declaration, the way in which a declaration can be used to motivate inspections or to guide inspectors. And you did have OPCW inspectors able to interview personnel, review documents, compare samples. I mean, all of this was, I think, extremely valuable, and it allows us now, at the present time, to start to assign blame. So that's why you have the difference between, the 50 or the 4. There are 4 instances where we can say for sure that the Assad regime was responsible.
But Valerie, let me sort of be somewhat provocative and just posit this. I mean, so you had a Syria situation with chemical weapons, sanctions, limited military strikes, condemnations, declarations, and at the end of the day, Bashar Assad was using chemical weapons to slaughter his own people. So that was in the chemical context. Then let's take the Syrian nuclear context. Okay, Syria was building the Al-Khaybar plutonium reactor with North Korean help. There was a lot of discussion about this. Bush administration decided that they wanted to handle that diplomatically through a process. And the Israelis said, thanks very much, President Bush, turned around and blew the reactor to smithereens. And Syria no longer has a nuclear program. And thank God, because if it had, either Bashar Assad or ISIS might have been in control of nuclear weapons. So isn't the lesson from that in the face of a brutal dictator building WMD, willing to use WMD, that you're better off obliterating the program rather than using the mechanisms of the UN or the NPT or whatever other agency? I mean, I just put that out provocatively to all of you.
It works for a while.
I think it also works with a single reactor versus a chemical weapon program where the production facilities are much more.
Right, but they're not complying with the NPT anyway in terms of the follow-up inquiries, inspections, and so on. So we don't know if the Syrian nuclear program is finished.
Yeah, there's actually a question about.
Yeah, and I think that was a very important part of Secretary's discussion because we don't know that. So. But what we do know about Bashar al Assad and his behavior is that he responds to military action, unilateral military action, for a time. It's the mowing the grass concept, except here it's not mowing the whole yard. It's like pinpointed, albeit very important parts of the yard.
Okay. Orde, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, Valerie's right. There have been some small victories along the way in terms of, not holding accountable, but sort of attributing blame for the chemical weapons strikes, et cetera. But overall, I'm concerned that the message of Bashar al Assad winning this civil war and not being held accountable for all of the things he's done, including in the WMD arena, including with regard to non-WMD atrocities. The message to rogue regimes is you ought to fight with no holds barred, and if you win, you won't pay a price for it. It sends, unfortunately, a green light to other rogue regimes, other brutal dictators, to fight no holds barred and to violate all of these norms. And it seems to me that we need to find a way of reversing that. And since it looks like Bashar al-Assad will win, we have to find some other way of reversing that. And I don't know whether what that would be, but it seems to me that ought to be a high priority because it's not just about Bashar al-Assad. There's a serious issue here of deterring future brutal dictators like Bashar al-Assad from engaging in the things that he did.
Okay, so let's sort of switch topics to the second part of Yilem's speech, which was really about Iran. Or you had mentioned sort of one of your takeaways was about the Israeli Atomic Archive and its importance. And I know there was a real debate in the analyst community about the importance of that archive. There were people who said it wasn't a big deal, there was nothing new. Even if it was new, it wasn't a violation of the JCPOA or the NPT or the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. What is your view of the significance and enduring importance of that atomic archive? What does it say to you, and specifically as a lawyer, an international lawyer, can one say that the existence of it is a violation of the JCPOA and these international agreements?
Yeah, in my view, the Iranian nuclear archives seem to indicate that Iran is currently in violation of its obligations under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and Iran's Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. As I said, Ilham made a somewhat different but similar point in her speech. Look, the archives show that the Iranian nuclear weapons program was larger, more sophisticated, more focused, and more advanced than previously understood. The archives contain considerable previously unknown data on Iranian nuclear weapons design, high explosives tests related to nuclear weapons development, individuals involved with the nuclear program, and sites for research, development, and testing. Some of the archive images appear to show undisclosed equipment employed for nuclear weapons work. You know, in discussing U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, the IAEA and many analysts have asserted that Iran is in compliance with the deal's terms, right? Implying Iran is not in violation of its nuclear-related obligations or commitments, and that the sole concern is a future change in Iranian behavior, right? Under that view, the international community is currently in a waiting mode, with Iran claiming the moral high ground and holding the reins at the brink of a nuclear breakout, right? Its nuclear program largely unassailable until it chooses to dash for a bomb at the time it deems most propitious. But Iran, the Atomic Archive, provides substantial evidence of current Iranian violation of its obligations under the NPT and the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. Too little attention, it seems to me, has been paid to this. The IAEA and the broader international community need to investigate these questions now, and Iran is obligated to comply, to cooperate with the IAEA on their investigation. By investigating now, the IAEA would both fulfill its mandate and help to significantly reduce Iran's ability to dash for a bomb at a time for its choice. Right? I mean, the problem is that legal and political commitments tend to serve as effective constraints only if they're enforced. And the failure to punish maybe lesser violations, such as retention of prohibited nuclear weapons design material, or retention of information received from outside nuclear weapons engineers, that typically serves to embolden greater violations. If you're not going to hold Iran accountable for holding on to this material, then Iran, it seems to me, is going to be more likely to dash to create a nuclear weapon at a time of its choosing.
Okay. So, Valerie, do you agree with that analysis? I mean, so here, the argument he's making, or it's making, is pretty definitive. He's saying that there's explicit violations, or at least the NPT, the CSA, and I know Orde didn't get into the JCPOA itself, but there's been an argument that Section T of the JCPOA, which specifically prohibits Iran from, I think it's seeking, acquiring, developing nuclear weapons, that the retention of this massive archive for nuclear weaponization is a violation of Section T of the JCPOA. So are you as confident as Orde is?
I'm not. I mean, not having seen, no surprise to you probably, not having seen the full scope of the archive, having seen really a quite limited amount that was in Prime Minister Netanyahu's presentation, and then that's been released in some news stories since then. My assessment is that it provides a lot more detail, and in some cases images, which are of course quite vivid, about elements of Iran's nuclear weapon development history that we knew about in terms of the production of fissile material, weaponization of that fissile material, and testing.
Valerie, let me stop you there, because I'm not I don't want you to focus too much on whether it was new or not new, how much do we know, we don't know. I think there's a raging debate, which we can't really have because we don't know. We don't actually know. So what I'm asking more specifically, and I think what this is kind of Orde's point, is the fact that Iran retained that documentation. Not only retained that documentation, but then decided, after reaching the JCPOA, to take all of this information, consolidate it, and then go hide it in some warehouse in Tehran so that it could actually be used in the future, potentially for some potential military nuclear program. In your view, is that a violation of the JCPOA, the NPT, and or the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement?
Well, not being an international lawyer, I would say that it certainly violates the spirit, if I can revive a phrase that was used often in the past, the spirit of the JCPOA and certainly Iran's treaty commitments under the NPT. I think that it does reinforce a fundamental problem with the JCPOA, which was that Iran never made a full declaration of its nuclear work in the past. That declaration would have guided inspectors and been a strong mandate and basis for accessing military sites where this work took place. I mean, none of these things happened, and so the revelations to me just reinforce or shine a light on one of the main shortcomings of the JCPOA.
Okay. I'll go back to Orde in a second, but Andrew, I want to involve you here because I think we sort of skip past it too quickly. I mean, there is an argument that is made by folks in the Obama administration, by nonproliferation experts. I've heard this argument made certainly in Israel by some folks there that that the deal reached with the Russians and the Syrians on Assad's chemical weapons program, as you pointed out, it was a massive chemical weapons program. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, most of it was destroyed. They were able to get inspectors in there, and I think there is an argument made that it at least diminished what was otherwise a very significant risk, certainly to Israel and to Jordan and some of the neighboring countries. Do you accept that line of argument? And
yes, I do.
If not,
yes, I do.
Why not?
Well, I think there are a couple things. First of all, it massively reduced the declared stockpile of chemical weapons. That's indisputable, and that's a great victory in terms of trying to get these, horrible agents out of Syria. And at that point, Syria, the course of the war could have gone either way. I never thought the Assad regime was going to completely collapse, but it could have significantly contracted, and those agents could have gotten to the hands of even more irresponsible parties than people like Bashar Al Assad, and that was a risk. The problem, though, is, and this has been from the beginning, Western countries have highlighted this since shortly after the deal, I think about a year after, the declarations themselves were incomplete. And there were real concerns about that. That proved to be true in the sense of that they've used sarin since the destruction of the destruction of all the declared stockpile. So that remains a big problem. The larger problem, though, I think, is it ended up being a complete political failure in the sense that it was always put to us that it was either a strike or we had the chemical weapons deal. Well, in and outside of the U.S. government, this is a big debate. I mean, there could have been a strike, and you get the political bounce, and you get the deal. And that would have perhaps taken us in a better direction. We'll never know that. So unfortunately, we end up with a rogue regime, so to speak, who only controls 60% of its territory, under Iran's control, and with outstanding issues on the CWC and the NPT.
All right. So let me sort of turn back to Iran and back to you, Orde, because we're talking about rogue regimes. We're talking about certainly imperfect arms control agreements or nonproliferation agreements. We're talking about the fact that you can get certain declarations, but at the end of the day, they're incomplete. So I was pulling some stats here. July 18th, so Ali Akbar Saleh, who's the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, announces that they built a factory that can produce rotors for up to 60 IR-6 centrifuges a day, and that the factory has started all its work. And then Salehi separately said that Iran now has a stockpile of about 950 tons of uranium, including 400 tons that were imported after the JCPOA was finalized. So significant? Do these raise concerns for you? We are in the business, we're in the process of reimposing sanctions against Iran. And what are we going to do about those IR-6 centrifuges, that now massive stockpile of uranium? Talk a little bit about this, and in the context also of some of the other violations that you believe are happening.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I just briefly want to go back to the point about the Iranian nuclear archives. the existence of the Iranian nuclear, with all of this data about how to make nuclear weapons and all the experiments that Iran did, or whatever, you contrast that with what happened in the Libya and South Africa situation, right? Those are countries that really came clean, right? Pursuant to an agreement with the US and UK, Libya in 2004 allowed a team of British and American government experts to enter the country, completely dismantle its WMD infrastructure, right? Libya turned over the nuclear weapons designs it had received. And the US-UK team shipped out of Libya more than 1,000 tons of sensitive documents and nuclear and missile components. I mean, that is a country really coming clean with regard to nuclear weapons. And the same thing with regard to South Africa, right? South Africa decided in 1990 to dismantle its nuclear weapons program and devices, destroyed the hardware, technical design, manufacturing information. In 1993, they burned over 12,000 documents containing that kind of information. And in contrast, you have the Iranian regime that was basically holding all of the information, and according to the information, and I haven't seen the archives myself, but according to the press reports, right, they have been continuing the work, just under a different guise. And so it seems to me that this all, there's a violation going on there, and when you contrast it with what happened in the Libya and South Africa situation, you really, it brings out the problem with the current Iran nuclear situation. With regard to Ali Akbar Salehi's announcement on July 18th, I took a quick look, and it looks like these may both be steps that are designed to demonstrate Iranian restlessness without clearly violating the JCPOA, right? I note that Salehi said a factory has been built and started, and not that additional centrifuges have been produced or installed, which would raise serious questions. The uranium stockpile appears to refer to non-enriched uranium rather than enriched uranium. Now, the challenge, when you're already throwing so much against Iran sanctions-wise, is that you have very little left to specifically respond to and deter incremental problematic steps. So if this is a matter, obviously, of violating the JCPOA, which it may not be, since the U.S. has withdrawn from the JCPOA, right, it would be up to the EU3, who are still in the deal, to respond with commensurate measures. What do they have? What are their plans to respond to incremental violations of the JCPOA, or even incremental violations of the NPT and the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement? I've seen no evidence of such a plan, certainly no announcement of if Iran does X, we will respond with Y, and it seems to me that's something you need to have.
It struck me in Assistant Secretary Pomplete's speech that there's she was some reference to Iranian WMD. Other Iranian WMD? What do we know of Iran's chemical weapons program or their biological weapons program? Do we know much? I seem to recall also that the four main statutes of sanctions legislation that were passed by Congress have a termination provision that those statutory sanctions will only be terminated permanently when Iran permanently dismantles its nuclear, chemical, biological programs. So is that speculative? Do we know much in the public domain about those other programs?
I was struck by that sentence in her speech, actually. It seemed to be a little bit different than the formulations I've seen in the past. I had a chance to very, very quickly look at the annual chemical weapons compliance report by the State Department, last issued in March of 2018, which actually had very little to say about, for example, an Iranian chemical weapons program. It just states, right, based on available information, the U.S. can't certify Iran has met its obligations under the convention. Yet here she's talking about how one of the problems with the JCPOA is that it didn't address Iran's other WMD programs. Is she indicating that now she believes that Iran does have other WMD programs? If so, that appears, at least with regard to chemical weapons, didn't have a chance to check biological weapons, to be perhaps a little bit of a change from the compliance report that her own team issued in March 2018. I think it'd be interesting for somebody to probe and see, Was this a significant statement? Was this an indication that something is going on? There's new information with regard to an Iranian chemical or biological weapons program, or was it just a phrase that's in there and maybe we're putting a little too much emphasis on it?
There was a recommended next step for an enterprising reporter who wants to follow up on that, because that is very interesting. All right, I think we're pretty much out of time. I think we're going to go to Q&A. So we'll have microphones going around. Please put up your hand. I see my old friend, Mark Fitzpatrick, over there. Managed to get by security.
Hey, thanks very much for the invitation. This is great. And I'm so glad that you got to this compliance issue with Iran, because crisis of compliance, it's obvious with Syria. I mean, first order non-compliance, using chemical weapons today. But Iran issue, Assistant Secretary Public didn't mention any cases of non-compliance. She did refer one time to Iranian non-compliance with its obligations, but didn't mention any examples other than the one Orde picked up on not clarifying how they got past those past cases of safeguards non-compliance from a decade or more ago. But Orde, you think that they're still in non-compliance because of the atomic archives. Can you, with some degree of specificity, say what provisions of the NPT, of Iran's safeguards obligations, or of the JCPOA, the retention of documents of past nuclear weapons development work, and Dr. Publi did say past, what are the specific provisions that are being violated?
Sure.
Thank you.
So the principal relevant NPT provision is Article 2, under which Iran is obligated not to manufacture or otherwise acquire nuclear weapons or seek or receive any assistance in their manufacture. It seems to me that Iran's evident retention of the atomic archive, including its own nuclear weapons design work, as well as the tangible substantive assistance it has received, and its apparent keeping together of its nuclear weapons research team, puts Iran currently in violation of Article 2 as it has long been interpreted by the United States. And I'm planning to publish something on this shortly. Seems to me the most appropriate and effective way to remedy this continuing violation of the NPT would be for the IAEA to do something similar to what was done with regard to Libya and South Africa, to destroy all information equipment in Iran, including in the atomic archive, which has no purpose other than to contribute to the building of a nuclear explosive device. Now, Iran's Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, which Iran has entered into with the IAEA pursuant to Article 3 of the NPT, requires Iran to provide the IAEA with information concerning all nuclear material in Iran which is subject to safeguards, and with information about the features of facilities relevant to safeguarding such material. The Atomic Archive appears to show that Iran's nuclear program is far more extensive than IAEA inspectors previously understood. Iran appears to have had and may still have nuclear-related material, activities, and facilities that it was and is required by the Comprehensive Safeguard Agreement to declare to the IAEA, but has not declared to the IAEA. That would place Iran in current violation of both its Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement and NPT Article 3, which requires Iran to comply with the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. It seems to me that one remedy for that is the IAEA should undertake special inspections of previously undeclared and other suspect sites reflected in the Atomic Archive to determine the extent, purposes, and significance of Iran's failure to report to the IAEA nuclear material activities and facilities as required by the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement.
Can I just add to that? Sorry, Valerie, you want to add to that?
I would like
Yeah.
to briefly. I think when we think about compliance with the JCPOA, I think something that the Assistant Secretary didn't reference, but I think is important, is to look at some of the recent allegations in UN Secretary General reports specifically related to nuclear procurement. I mean, I know there's a debate about who's responsible, and perhaps the exporting state is technically in noncompliance for having sent nuclear material to Iran outside of the procurement channel established by the JCPOA. But Iran obviously has some obligations on its side as well, and the most recent report contained a number of allegations about nuclear dual-use sales or transfers to Iran that did not go through the procurement channel. I think that's a compliance question that I wish got a bit more attention.
So I just take quick prerogative as moderator, but Mark, I also think Section T of the JCPOA is worth again taking a look at. I mean, Iran it explicitly prohibits Iran from seeking, acquiring, and developing nuclear weapons, and I mean, just sort of common sense view that if you're taking a massive archive of detailed designs and documents about how to actually build nuclear weapons, you're taking those documents that are sitting in various places in Iran, you're consolidating all of it, then you're clandestinely moving that to a warehouse in Tehran, hopefully to keep it away from the IAEA and the prying eyes of Western intelligence. That even just a common sense reading of that Section T suggests that Iran is in violation because it's attempting to still seek WMD. If it was not attempting to seek WMD, it would turn over these documents. It wouldn't move these documents. It wouldn't try to keep these documents away from the prying eyes of weapons inspectors. So, Michael.
Mark, you were famously in the fix not nix camp in terms of the JCPOA. And what I would like to ask the panel is, having identified these problems, where we go from here. Because the documentation emerged about a week before President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. Now, one course of action might have been to actually confront the Iranians over this documentation and initiate a discussion, or at least attempt to, and then have that be a factor in your decision as to whether to stay with the agreement. But instead, they got out of the agreement altogether, so we're not party to this agreement in the United States. At the same time, they're putting sanctions, pretty severe sanctions on, basically tied to Iranian behavior in the region. So if Iran were to satisfy U.S. concerns on the nuclear front, we won't take the sanctions off because they have to cease their ties with Hezbollah and do a whole range of activities. So we're not party to this agreement. Sanctions don't seem to be an effective tool for resolving compliance concerns on the JCPOA because they're tied to Iranian behavior more broadly. Europe is keeping the agreement, so the West is no longer unified. And as much as President Trump talks about wanting to talk with the Iranians, there is in fact, no new negotiation going on and no discussion whatsoever that anybody can identify. So where are the next, I'd like to hear the panel say, having gotten out of this agreement and pursued this policy, how you think one could actually constructively try to resolve these issues with the Iranians?
I have lots of ideas, but I'm the moderator, so I'm gonna turn it over to you guys. I mean, I think just let me take Michael's question and ask you sort of somewhat of a counterfactual. I mean, Orde, Valerie, Andrew as well. I mean, if Iran indeed was in violation of Section T of the agreement per this nuclear archive because it was seeking nuclear weapons, why not actually take that violation, go to the Joint Commission, accuse Iran of being in violation, give them a certain amount of time to explain themselves and come clean on their PMD, on the PMD issue. If they didn't, move at the Joint Commission and then at the UN to unilaterally snap back UN sanctions against Iran while the United States stays on the deal and then uses tough sanctions, non-nuclear sanctions, against the central bank for supporting Bashar Assad or financing Hezbollah or the various malign activities that Michael was referencing. Why not keep the United States in the deal and assert Iranian violation and let the Iranians, say that they're not in violation for moving hundreds of thousands of documents to some secret warehouse so that they could restart a WMD program in the future? Why not?
Why not indeed?
Well, no.
So why not indeed? Yeah, I co-wrote a piece with my colleague Benham over there saying exactly that before the president withdrew from the deal, right? It was titled "Atomic Archive Strengthens Case to Fix Nuclear Deal," and basically my article, which is published with Benham, argued that the U.S. should have stayed in the deal and used the additional information in the archives to push Iran and take advantage of not just the NPT, right? I mean, when I talked about violations, obviously I focused on the NPT and the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement because, Iran is clearly still in those. Those are legally binding. It's a little hard now for the U.S. to be making a lot of arguments about the JCPOA and violations of Section T since we have withdrawn from the JCPOA. What's the route forward? I mean, obviously, the administration has decided to ramp up sanctions on Iran and try to reach a new deal with Iran. Is that going to be successful? I don't know. I mean, I do note that a lot of European companies are pulling out of doing business with Iran. Will Iran, under pressure from those sanctions, agree to a deal better than the JCPOA? I don't know. I suppose it could happen. Was that my preferred course of action? No, it wasn't. You can read my piece.
I also wonder, I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but what is the administration's desired outcome for the JCPOA? Does it see a way forward whereby the United States is no longer in the JCPOA, but there is sufficient value in some elements of the agreement to allow it to not actively try to get rid of it entirely? I think my impression from comments is that they're talking about the JCPOA in the past tense, and the sanctions that they're looking to put back into place, or to have put back into place, are aimed at accelerating that. I do think that there is some value for the JCPOA to continue, even if the United States is not in it. I mean, you have things like the procurement channel, you have things like the Joint Commission, you have the ability for enhanced inspections. I mean, there are a series of things. You have the reconfiguration of the Iraq reactor and the changes at the Fordo enrichment plant. So there are, from a nonproliferation point of view, I think there are benefits to have the JCPOA. I think the administration should see that there are benefits to have the JCPOA continue. But I think for me, that's the immediate question in terms of looking toward the future.
Andrew, you raised a great point, I think, on this in the Syria context, which I hadn't really thought of, which is, there was a chemical weapons deal. President Obama decided, not to, quote, enforce the red line, not to launch military strikes. He got this deal. It was clearly an imperfect deal. It was a flawed deal. It solved a certain short-term problem, but it didn't solve a medium to long-term problem. And you underscored something very important, which is the sort of political dimensions of that deal and the political consequences of that deal, which I think at the end of the day we all agree, politically speaking, it's been a massive failure and a catastrophe with respect to Bashar Assad and the survival of this regime. Any lessons to draw from that with respect to Iran, the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, this whole discussion that sort of non-proliferation nerds tend to have?
It's an excellent question. So I think the major criticism of the deal from a Syria context or from a regional context was that the problem was not per se about the agreement concerning, but was about what was baked into the agreement. And what was baked into the agreement, not to mix metaphors here too much, was a license for Iran to expand in the region, which it did massively, right? I mean, that's undisputable. And this is where it gets down to, and it's very easy. We think in terms of states. So we say oftentimes that Bashar Al Assad is winning the Syrian civil war. That's really only in a legal case. If you look at Iranian influence in Syria, it is a mosaic of forces which are interspersed within the Syrian, what used to be the Syrian Arab army. And therefore you get what I think in Israel, I have heard referred to, but also in other places, is as a massive strategic failure. So what I expected after withdrawing from, what would make sense to me is after withdrawing from the nuclear agreement, that you would put in place a plan to roll back Iranian influence in the region. The problem, of course, in that is that you need to devote military resources, at least in part, to doing that. And at least in the case of Syria, passively holding territory and keeping it out of the hands of the Assad regime so that you can financially and other means strangle it in a way and pressure it. But until now, this is still a matter of dispute, whether there was recently the deal between the Israelis and the Russians and the Jordanians over the southwest, and then there's the issue about what to do in eastern Syria and should U.S. troops stay. So it would seem to me that now that this license has been revoked, the United States would be in a good place to benefit from that and to keep those forces there, both to keep ISIS down and to use leverage points on the Assad regime as we try and pull the Iranians, with Russian support, out of that country.
Yet the president keeps flirting with this idea that he's going to withdraw the 2,000 U.S. troops from eastern Syria, bring them all home, and what, cut a deal with Putin to police Iranian behavior?
Or a drawdown. I mean, there are various reiterations of this, and it's a controversial issue inside of the inside of the U.S. government, we could see a reduction of troops. I think the main driver, though, of this, and this is important to watch, and this is in the context of the Southwest Agreement, ISIS still exists in Syrian territory. And what is underreported is how much it exists in the center of the country under regime control. They're making raids around Palmyra on a regular basis. That's quite far westward. So the problem is if troops are withdrawn too quickly, then the likelihood of ISIS reconstituting itself or reasserting itself more quickly goes up. And I think that's something we all need to avoid, whether it's in terms of regional security or international security.
Okay. Any further questions? Over here, sir.
Hi, thanks. Patrick Tucker with Defense One. A very comparatively dumb question. You mentioned these archives at several different points. Do we have an absolute sense of their actual size, their actual location? Like, for instance, could there possibly be more of them than are currently accounted for? Because you seem to be making the case that their very existence shows the violations of JCPOA. But if our understanding of their size is not complete, then how do we exactly make that determination? And what's the method, after our withdrawal and everything else, for determining the size and the completeness of our understanding of those archives?
I would say for further details, you should talk to the gentleman sitting next to you. Introduce yourself. Dr. Ollie Heidemann, who was former Deputy Director General of the IAEA for Safeguards. So when the event's over, you guys should have a chat.
But I just note with regard to that, right? I mean, the Israelis, I mean, all I know is what I've read in the New York Times and other press reports, right? That the Israelis went in and they took some of what was in that warehouse, but far from all of it. They weren't able to carry all of it. We don't know whether there are other sites where there's archival material. We don't know if the Iranians have kept other copies of this archival material. And so it seems to me this is a job for the International Atomic Energy Agency, right? To go visit that site, see what is left, if that material has left, that probably the Iranians moved everything out of that site after they discovered the Israelis broke in. Well, where did they take it to? This, it seems to me, is a job for the International Atomic Energy. This is why they exist, to track down this sort of material relevant to Iran's nuclear weapons program. And so far as I can tell, the Israelis have turned over what they got. They turned over copies, according to the press reports, to the U.S., to the Europeans, to the IAEA, but I have heard no reference to the IAEA going into Iran and trying to see what is left. And certainly, according to the Israeli reports, there's plenty left, because the Israelis only took some of what was in that warehouse, let alone what was in other warehouses.
Okay. I think on that note, thank you all for coming, and thank you to C-SPAN for broadcasting this, and certainly feel free to stay afterwards for follow-up questions. We'll see you soon at another FTD event. Thanks, guys.